अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आज आपकी मुलाकात डॉक्टर तलत अफजा से मनी एंड बैंकिंग के 35th लेक्चर में हो रही है। बेसिकली हमारा आज का लेक्चर पिछले ही लेक्चर की कंटिन्यूएशन है। ट्राई टू रिकॉल कि वी वर डिस्कसिंग द सेंट्रल बैंक in the previous 3 or 4 lectures. But in the last lecture, we were trying to look at the role of the central bank in creating the credit and money in an economy. Okay, how the central bank controls the money and credit in an economy. And there we started talking about that basically central bank controls the financial system through the banking system. And what are the tools in the hands of the central bank that we are going to discuss? But previously we talked about that central bank has a balance sheet. Just like any manufacturing concern or any commercial bank, central bank also prepares its balance sheet. It has assets and the liabilities just like commercial banks. But there the role of course is different. The reserves basically which are kept by the other banks with the central bank. They are the assets for the other banks, other means commercial banks, and they are the liabilities of the central bank. Similarly, the loans which the other banks have taken from the central bank, they are the liability of the commercial banks, but they are the asset of the central bank. And then we also looked at different transactions and see how these transactions can affect the size and the composition of the central bank's balance sheet. There we considered 4 different types of transaction, starting with the open market operation. And then in the open market operation, we assume what if the central bank purchases the securities, and these are the government securities held by the other banks. And we looked at it and we see that the assets of the bank, central bank, will increase by the amount of the securities it has purchased. But in order to make the payment for the securities, the central bank is going to increase the reserves of the other banks. Now, the reserves of the other banks are the liabilities of the central bank, but they are the asset of the other banks. Now, only central bank has the authority to create reserve, to increase the reserves of the other banks. That is one unique role of the central bank, and this is the role through which it controls the deposit creation, money supply, and the credit in an economy. And this is what we are going to inshallah discuss today, and what is the mechanism. And then there is also another unique role of the central bank, and that is of the printing of money. The central bank has monopoly over the printing of money. So both the reserves of the other banks and the currency, they are both the liabilities. Now, the central bank can increase or decrease its own liabilities. It has the authority, it has the power to do that. And through this power, the central bank basically controls the deposit creation and then the money supply as well as the level of credit in an economy. Then we said, okay, there can be another transaction in which not the central bank, rather the other banks. Other banks, they borrow from the central bank. When they borrow from the central bank, they also increase their reserves with the central bank. So both of these transactions, whether the other banks are borrowing or whether the central bank is purchasing the securities, they change the size of the central bank's balance sheet. By size, what happens actually is the total reserves of the banking system, they increase. We can also talk about another scenario in which the central bank goes for the foreign exchange intervention. And there we say, if the central bank purchases the foreign securities, which means denominated in another currency, then what happens? The size of the central bank's balance sheet again increases. The only difference here is that under the asset, the securities which are denominated in foreign currency, they will increase. But on the liability side, the reserves of the other banks will increase, because when the central bank purchases these securities from the other banks, the payment basically is made in the form of increasing the reserve account of the bank from which the central bank has made this particular purchase. तो ये कुछ ट्रांजैक्शंस हैं तीनों की तीनों, जिसमें नंबर 1 ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशन, नंबर 2 फॉरेन एक्सचेंज इंटरवेंशन एंड नंबर 3 द बोरोइंग फ्रॉम सेंट्रल बैंक बाय द अदर बैंक्स, डिस्काउंट बोरोइंग. 3 of these, they change the size of the balance sheet of the central bank, they increase the reserves. And of course, the reverse is true if we go for the reverse transaction. If we go for the sale of the securities, if we go for the sale of the foreign currency denominated securities. But anyhow, these are the transactions through which central bank increases its balance sheet, changes the size of the balance sheet. And then finally, we talked about the cash withdrawal by the general public. There we saw that the cash withdrawal by the general public from a commercial bank, because we hold an account with a commercial bank. So what happens when we go for the withdrawal of the cash from a commercial bank, then our checking account is debited and then our currency holding will increase. But with the commercial bank here, what will happen? The liability of the commercial bank in the form of our checking account will decrease. And then of course the currency holding will also decrease. And similarly, with that decrease here, the reserves with the central bank will also decrease. So with this fourth transaction, the withdrawal of the cash by the non-bank public, we saw there is a change in the composition of the central bank's balance sheet, but there is no change in the size of the balance sheet. So the actions taken by the central bank, the first two actions, the first one is the purchase of the securities and the second one is the intervention in the foreign exchange market. These are the two actions undertaken by the central bank. The third action, which is undertaken by the commercial bank, the loan, the discount loan which they take from the central bank. All three of them will result in an increase, or in a change rather, in the change in the central bank's balance sheet and the reserves of the commercial bank which they keep with the central bank. Based on this, we started discussing the idea of the deposit multiplier. And then we said, okay, how a change in the reserve requirement can lead to a change in the deposit. But before we go for a detailed analysis of this deposit multiplier, we made certain simplified assumptions. But before even those assumptions, we just started talking about the deposit multiplier in a single bank. There we assume just a single bank is there. And we said, okay, when the government purchases the securities from a single bank, what happens? The reserve of the bank increase. Now with the increase in the reserves, the bank has the capacity to lend more. So the bank can lend it to someone else, and that someone else is going to deposit again in another bank. The process will continue. But here we are making another simplified assumption that there is no reserve requirement. So in the absence of the reserve requirement, what will be the form of our deposit creation multiplier? That we have reflected here. That required reserve is equal to RD times D, or change in required reserve is equal to RD times change in D. What basically is RD? Now RD here is the reserve requirement. For simplicity, let's assume that we are having a single bank and now we are introducing the reserve requirement as well. So whatever is deposited with a single bank, if the reserve requirement, let's suppose, is 10, then 10% will be kept by this commercial bank and the rest will be lent out to someone else. And then in the second transaction again, that amount, suppose we are talking about 100,000 and if the reserve requirement is 10%, then out of 100,000, 10,000 will be the required reserve and 90,000 will be handed over in the form of loan. And later on, when that 90,000 is deposited again in the bank, then 10% of that, which is 9,000, will be kept in the form of the required reserve and 81,000 will be given in the form of a loan. Overall, this process will continue. So we can write it down with the 10% reserve requirement or any percentage of reserve requirement, that we can say that the change in deposit, change in D, is equal to RD, which is the required reserve ratio, times the change in R. So we have alternatively RR, required reserve, is equal to RD times D, or change in RR is equal to RD times change in D. So for every dollar increase in reserves, deposits will increase by 1 over RD. Now this term here, 1 over RD, represents the simple deposit expansion multiplier. A decrease in the reserve will generate a deposit contraction in a multiple amount. कि अगर हमारे डिपॉजिट्स जो हैं वो कम हो जाते हैं क्योंकि हमारे रिजर्व कम हो जाते हैं, तो क्या होगा? रिजर्व कम होने का मतलब, फॉर एग्जांपल वी कैन से कि अगर सेंट्रल बैंक जो है वो सेल करता है सिक्योरिटीज को, तो जो कमर्शियल बैंक्स जो हैं दे परचेज दो सिक्योरिटीज फ्रॉम द सेंट्रल बैंक, दे मेक पेमेंट आउट ऑफ देयर रिजर्व अकाउंट्स व्हिच दे आर कीपिंग विद द सेंट्रल बैंक. तो लेवल ऑफ द रिजर्व्स कम हो जाने की वजह से हमारे पास जो है वो डिपॉजिट जो है वो भी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कर जाएंगे, बिकॉज वी हैव दिस रिलेशनशिप चेंज इन डी इज इक्वल टू आर डी टाइम चेंज इन आर आर. नाउ इफ द चेंज इन आर आर इज नेगेटिव, मीनिंग देयर बाय कि अगर हमारे रिजर्व्स कम हो जाते हैं तो हमारे डिपॉजिट्स भी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कर जाएंगे. So 1 over RD goes in both ways. That अगर हमारे पास रिजर्व बढ़ते हैं तो डिपॉजिट जो है वो बढ़ेंगे by multiple of 1 over RD. अगर हमारे रिजर्व जो है वो कम हो जाते हैं तो डिपॉजिट्स जो है वो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट करेंगे by 1 over RD. Now here, if we take a simple example of 10%, then 1 over RD, if RD is 10%, that is 10. So if there is a 1 rupee increase in the reserve, the deposits through the entire banking system, they will increase in multiple of 10. That is 10 rupees. This was about the deposit creation multiplier. और ये इसी तक हमने अपना जो है पिछला लेक्चर डिटेल में डिस्कस किया था. And then we started talking about the money multiplier. अब money multiplier में we are trying to build a relationship between two variables. One is the money supply, M, and the other is monetary base. आपको याद होगा कि हमने monetary base को define किया था in our I think previous lecture. And then we said कि monetary base is reserves प्लस द करेंसी. और जो हमारी एम मनी सप्लाई थी उसको हमने डिफाइन किया था एज करेंसी एंड द डिपॉजिट्स. अब इन दोनों वेरिएबल के दरमियान में क्या रिलेशनशिप है? दैट रिलेशनशिप कम्स थ्रू मनी मल्टीप्लायर. सो वी से द मनी मल्टीप्लायर शोज how the quantity of money, which means checking account plus currency, is related to the monetary base, which is the reserves in the banking system plus currency held by the non-bank public. Now, if we take M for the money multiplier and MB for monetary base, the quantity of money M is, the relationship is that quantity of money M is equal to money multiplier times the monetary base. So that's why we call the monetary base as the high power money. कि हमारी मनी सप्लाई इज इक्वल टू द मनी मल्टीप्लायर टाइम्स द मॉनेटरी बेस. अब इस एम या मनी मल्टीप्लायर को फर्दर एक्सप्लेन करने के लिए वी नीड टू एक्सप्लेन फ्यू मोर टर्मिनोलॉजीज. नाउ व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट द रिजर्व्स, वी कैन डिकम्पोज द बैंक्स रिजर्व इनटू टू कैटेगरीज. वन इज द required reserve and the other is the excess reserve. अभी तक जितनी हमने डिस्कशन की थी उसमें हमने ये अज्यूम किया था कि हमारे पास एक्सेस रिजर्व 0 है, यानी जब हमने अभी डिपॉजिट क्रिएशन मल्टीप्लायर की भी बात की थी तो वी मेड स्ट्रिंजेंट असम्पशंस कि बैंक्स जो है वो सिर्फ और सिर्फ रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व ही रखते हैं, और हमने ये अज्यूम किया था कि एक्सेस रिजर्व जो है वो 0 है. साथ साथ हमने एक और भी अजम्पशन ली थी कि हमारे जो नॉन बैंक पब्लिक है रिजर्व के बढ़ने के साथ साथ उनकी करेंसी होल्डिंग जो है वो नहीं बढ़ती. इन सिंपल वर्ड्स, नॉन बैंक पब्लिक दे डू नॉट विथड्रॉ कैश फ्रॉम द एडिशनल डिपॉजिट्स व्हिच हैव बीन जनरेटेड थ्रू द मनी मल्टीप्लायर प्रोसेस. सो विद दिस two stringent assumption and a reserve requirement of 10%, we came up with that deposit multiplier. लेकिन अब in real life situation में we need to relax this assumption and we also need to decompose our reserve into two components. One is the required reserve and the other is the excess reserve. So consider the following relationships. Money is equal to currency plus the checkable deposit. Capital letter M stands for money and that is equal to C for currency and D for checkable deposit. So M is equal to C plus D. Then comes the next, monetary base, and we call it as MB. So MB is equal to currency plus reserves. So MB is equal to C plus R. And then we look at the reserves. The reserves are equal to required reserve plus the excess reserve. So we are decomposing R into RR plus ER. Now the amount of the excess reserve, which now here we are assuming they are positive, and in real life scenario they are normally positive. अब बैंक्स जो हैं कितना excess reserve जो है वो होल्ड करेंगे? It depends on the interest rate in the economy. अब अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट हाई हो तो एक्सेस रिजर्व जो है वो लो होंगे. Why is that so? Because हमारे जो रिजर्व्स हैं, रिजर्व्स को आपको याद होगा हमने बात की थी कि हमारे बैंक्स जो है वो रिजर्व रखते हैं इन देयर वॉल्ट कैश और विद द सेंट्रल बैंक, और दोनों ही सूरत हाल में दैट पोर्शन डज नॉट अर्न एनी इंटरेस्ट. सो एक्सेस रिजर्व की एक अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट है. एंड व्हाट बेसिकली इज दैट अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट? द अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट इज द इंटरेस्ट फॉरगोन, कि जब वो इन्वेस्ट नहीं करते, अगर वही अमाउंट उन्होंने इन्वेस्ट की होती तो उसके ऊपर जो है दे मस्ट हैव अर्न सर्टेन इंटरेस्ट. So, since they are not earning that interest, that becomes the cost. And then also, we need to look at the benefit. What basically is the benefit of keeping the excess reserve? The banks, they try to keep the excess reserve if they foresee a liquidity problem. if they foresee that the depositors are going to ask for their money back more than what they have in the form of the required reserve, so they can bring that risk of illiquidity down and they can avoid the bank panic. So overall, how much excess reserve the banks are going to hold depends on the interest rate. Higher the interest rate, lower will be the excess reserve, as well as the risk of illiquidity. If the risk of illiquidity is high, then the banks are supposed to keep a higher excess reserve. On the other hand, we have the second component, that is the money in the hands of the general public. कि how much cash or the money general public is going to keep in their hands. Again, when the general public keep money with them in the form of the currency, they are not earning any interest. So when the interest rate is high, then again the level of the currency holding will also decrease, because the interest rate basically is the cost of holding the money. So overall we see that interest rate is a regulating mechanism for the level of the excess reserve as well as the level of the currency holding. Moreover, now let's introduce the excess reserve ratio, which is ER over the deposits. So R is equal to, as we have already said, our total reserves, they can be decomposed into RR, required reserve, plus ER, which is the excess reserve. So RD times D we defined as the required reserve, and then ER we can define as excess reserve over deposit to deposit. And then we can write down R is equal to RD plus E of R over D, and then whole thing is multiplied by the deposits or the capital letter D. यानी कि अगर हम इसको गौर से देखें तो हमारे पास एक रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व रेशियो है और दूसरी है एक्सेस रिजर्व रेशियो. सो रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व रेशियो RD प्लस एक्सेस रिजर्व रेशियो ER ओवर D टाइम्स D जो है दैट इज आवर रिजर्व. प्रीवियसली हमने क्या देखा था कि हमारा R वाज इक्वल टू RD टाइम D ओनली. रीजन बीइंग कि हमने ये अज्यूम किया था कि हमारा ER इज इक्वल टू 0. बट इफ ER विच इज द एक्सेस रिजर्व दैट इज नॉट 0, then what will be the excess reserve ratio? ER over the deposit. So our RR now will be required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio times the deposit. So relationship is the same. The only thing is now we have introduced the concept of the excess reserve. Now the decision of how much currency to hold depends on the cost and benefits, where the cost is the interest foregone and the benefit is the lower risk and greater liquidity of currency. So as interest rate rises, cash become less desirable, but if the riskiness of the alternative holding rises or liquidity falls, then it becomes more desirable. वही बात जो कि मैंने पहले कही कि कितनी जो है वो करेंसी होल्डिंग होगी, दैट डिपेंड्स ऑन द लेवल ऑफ द इंटरेस्ट रेट. कि अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट ज्यादा हो जाएगा करेंसी होल्डिंग कम हो जाएगी, अगर दूसरी अल्टरनेटिव कॉस्टली हो जाएगी तो अगेन करेंसी विल बिकम मोर डिजायरेबल. अब इन सारे को अगर हम इकट्ठा करें, इफ वी ट्राई टू पुट दीज कंपोनेंट्स टुगेदर, सो वी नाउ हैव द करेंसी रेशियो एज C over D, that is currency to deposit ratio. Now we define the MB, which is the monetary base. We already defined as currency plus the reserve. अब हमने करेंसी को किस तरह डिफाइन किया है? We are saying currency to deposit ratio times the deposit is the currency. Plus अभी हमने डिफाइन किया है अपने रिजर्व्स को, which is the required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio times the D. So what we have here is monetary base is equal to currency to deposit ratio times the deposit plus required reserve ratio plus excess reserve ratio times the deposits. So if we rearrange, we can write down all of these three ratios here. Currency to deposit ratio plus the required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio times the deposit gives us the monetary base. तो अब अगर हम monetary base के बारे में बात करना चाहें तो we say our monetary base is equal to first ratio is currency to deposit ratio plus required reserve ratio and then plus the excess reserve ratio. All of these ratio added together times the deposits is our monetary base. This shows that monetary base has three uses, that is required reserves, excess reserves and cash in the hands of the non-bank public. कि अगर हमने अब monetary base को analyze करना हो तो we need to focus on these three things. और we can say कि हमारी जो monetary base है it is dependent on currency to deposit ratio, कि लोग जो है वो कितनी currency to deposit ratio रखना चाहते हैं. So this component जो है C over D is decided by the non-bank public. Then is the required reserve ratio RD which is decided by the central bank, the policy makers. And then is the excess reserve ratio which is decided by the commercial banks times the deposits. So in other words, when we talk about the monetary base, then the role of three participants, the general public in the form of currency to deposit ratio, the central bank in the form of the required reserve ratio, and then excess reserve ratio by the the banking sector or the commercial banks. So these three ratios added together multiplied by the deposit gives us the monetary base MB. Now deposit expansion with excess reserve and cash withdrawals. क्योंकि पहले हमने ये कहा था, जब बहुत सिंपल सा फार्मूला ड्राइव किया था, we said excess reserve ratio is 0 and we also said कि हमारे पास जो है currency withdrawal is also 0. C over D was 0. But having a positive C over D as well as positive excess reserve ratio, now we can have this relationship. कि deposits are equal to 1 over currency to deposit ratio plus required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio times the monetary base. कि अब हमारी monetary base और deposit का जो बीच में multiplier है जिसको हम कहते हैं कि deposit multiplier. Previously जब हमने बात की थी कि हमारे पास जो है वो excess reserve ratio भी 0 है और C over D currency to deposit ratio भी 0 है, तो हमारे पास एक simple deposit multiplier था and that was 1 over RD. But with the positive excess reserve ratio as well as C over D ratio, अब हमारा deposit multiplier जो है that is equal to 1 over first of all C over D ratio plus the required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio. So this is what we have here on this slide. 1 over C over D plus RD plus ER over D is our deposit multiplier. Now we want to derive the money multiplier. अभी हमने define किया था कि हमारा जो money multiplier है, it tells us the relationship between the money and the monetary base. And we defined it as, we said कि M is equal to, uppercase letter M is the money, which is equal to the lowercase letter m, which is the money multiplier, times MB, which is the monetary base. So from the above expression of the deposit multiplier, we can get the money multiplier. So in money multiplier, what we have is, rest of the expression remains the same. But only in the numerator, we add C over D ratio, which is the currency to deposit ratio. So we have M is equal to C over D plus 1 divided by C over D plus RD plus ER over D. Now in simple words, we have approximately the same multiplier which is the deposit multiplier, but we are multiplying it by the C over D ratio and that becomes the money multiplier. तो अब अगर हमें रिलेशनशिप देखना हो by relaxing the assumptions of zero excess reserve as well as the zero C over D ratio, so we can simply say that we take our deposit multiplier, which is 1 over C over D plus RD plus ER over D. इस रेशियो को, इस पूरी चीज को, एक्सप्रेशन को, if we multiply by C over D, mean we add C over D in the numerator. So C over D, which is the currency ratio, currency holding or withdrawal ratio, plus 1 over the same three ratios. So the denominator for the deposit multiplier and the money multiplier remains the same, but in numerator, for the deposit multiplier, we only have 1. For the money multiplier, we have C over D plus 1. Now we look at the quantity. The quantity of money M depends on three things: the monetary base, which is controlled by the central bank; reserve requirement, which again is controlled by the central bank; banks desire to hold excess reserve; and the public's demand for currency. कि अभी इसी एक्सप्रेशन से जिसमें हमने कहा कि M is equal to C over D plus 1 divided by C over D plus RD plus ER over D times the MB. तो अगर हमने डिटर्मिनेंट देखने हो कि हमारे पास मनी के डिटर्मिनेंट क्या क्या है, तो सबसे पहले हम MB को देख सकते हैं, मॉनेटरी बेस. और मॉनेटरी बेस में हमने क्या कहा कि मॉनेटरी बेस में हमारे पास करेंसी प्लस द रिजर्व्स, एंड द रिजर्व्स आर regulated by the central bank. So we can say कि monetary base is regulated by the central bank. Try to recall कि हमने ये कहा था कि central bank has the authority to change the reserves. Only it can write check against itself. And by doing so, the central bank can change the reserve of the commercial banks, which they keep with the central bank. So that is the first component, which is MB. Then looking at the money multiplier itself, the next is our required reserve ratio, RD. Now RD is a legal requirement which the policy makers put forward for compliance of the commercial banks. So again it is regulated by the policy makers. Now the quantity of money changes directly with the base, and for given amount of the base, an increase in either the reserve requirement or the holdings of excess reserve will decrease the quantity of money. अब इसको थोड़ा सा वन बाय वन देखना चाहेंगे हम कि मॉनेटरी बेस जो है उसका और M का आपस में क्या रिलेशनशिप है. There is a direct relationship between the two. अगर मॉनेटरी बेस MB बढ़ती है तो मनी जो है वो भी बढ़ जाएगी. अगर MB कम हो जाती है तो मनी जो है वो कम हो जाएगी. Then looking at the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio RD is coming in the denominator. So we see an inverse relationship between the money and the required reserve ratio. अगर required reserve ratio जो है वो बढ़ जाती है तो मनी जो है इन सर्कुलेशन कम हो जाएगी. Why? क्योंकि बैंक्स जो है वो ज्यादा से ज्यादा जब होल्ड करेंगे एज अ लीगली रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व, लेस विल बी अवेलेबल फॉर मेकिंग लोन्स. देयरफॉर थ्रू दैट लोन क्रिएशन एंड द डिपॉजिट क्रिएशन हमारी जो मनी की एक्सपेंशन है वो कम होगी. उसके साथ साथ हम एक्सेस रिजर्व की बात करते हैं. जैसे कि हमने कहा कि एक्सेस रिजर्व जो है दैट इज नॉट कंट्रोल्ड बाय द सेंट्रल बैंक, रादर बैंक्स दे डिसाइड फॉर देमसेल्व्स कि उन्होंने कितना एक्सेस रिजर्व जो है वो होल्ड करना है. सो इफ दे डिजायर टू होल्ड मोर एक्सेस रिजर्व, दे ट्राई टू अवॉइड द बैंक पैनिक, देन व्हाट विल हैपन? अगेन देयर इज एन इनवर्स रिलेशनशिप between the excess reserve holding and the money supply. कि अगर एक्सेस रिजर्व होल्डिंग बढ़ जाएगी तो बैंक क्या करेंगे, एक तो लीगली रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व है, देन एज द excess reserve increases, what will happen? Less will be available for lending. Therefore, deposit expansion कम हो जाएगी और money भी कम हो जाएगी. So, excess reserve is also negatively related with the money supply. Now we come to the fourth element, and the fourth element is C over D. Now we go back to the formula here. Now C over D is coming in the numerator as well as the denominator. If we look at the numerator one, we see a positive or direct relationship between M and C over D. But when we look at the C over D in the denominator, we see an inverse relationship. So, but the currency holdings affect both the numerator and the denominator of the multiplier. So, the effect is not immediately obvious. Now, the logic tells us that an increase in currency decreases the reserves and so decreases the money supply. अगर हम वैसे सोचना चाहें तो क्या होगा कि जब भी हमारे पास जो है वो करेंसी होल्डिंग बढ़ जाएगी तो क्या होगा, रिजर्व्स ऑफ द बैंक जो है वो कम हो जाएंगे, बिकॉज द रिजर्व्स एंड द डिपॉजिट्स ऑफ द बैंक दे आर डायरेक्टली रिलेटेड. और अगर डिपॉजिट्स में हम करेंसी विड्रॉल कर लें तो व्हाट हैपेंस, बैंक के रिजर्व जो है वो कम हो जाते हैं. तो बैंक के रिजर्व कम हो जाने की वजह से डेफिनेटली मनी सप्लाई जो है वो कम हो जाएगी. सो इंट्यूटिवली वी कैन सिंपली से कि दे आर इनवर्सली रिलेटेड. नाउ लेट्स समराइज ऑल ऑफ दिस डिस्कशन इन द फॉर्म ऑफ दिस पर्टिकुलर टेबल हियर. द फैक्टर्स अफेक्टिंग द क्वांटिटी ऑफ मनी. Now we said there are four major factors. The monetary base, who controls it? The central bank. Why? Because we define the monetary base as the reserve plus the currency. The reserves are controlled by the central bank and even the currency is printed by the central bank. So monetary base is controlled by the central bank, and if we look at a change or the change is increasing the monetary base will increase the quantity of money. Then comes the second component. The second component is the required reserve to deposit ratio. And who regulates? The bank regulators, the policy makers. They decide about the required reserve ratio. And if we assume a change and that change is increased, what will happen to the quantity of money? The quantity of money will decrease. Now, these are the same relationship जो अभी हमने फार्मूला के थ्रू भी देखा है कि हमारी रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व जो है वो डिनोमिनेटर में थी, इसलिए इनवर्स रिलेशनशिप बिटवीन द क्वांटिटी ऑफ मनी एंड द रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व रेशो. तो अगर रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व रेशो बढ़ती है तो हमारी क्वांटिटी ऑफ मनी जो है वो कम हो जाती है. Then the third factor is excess reserve to deposit ratio. Now, this is decided and controlled by the commercial banks themselves. Now, if again we look at a change and the change is increased, what is going to happen to the quantity of money? It is going to decrease because we see that in the denominator and there is an inverse relationship. Logically speaking, जब ज्यादा बैंक अपने पास रखेंगे and less will be lent out, then overall deposit creation slow होगी और money भी जो है वो उसकी quantity कम हो जाएगी. Then is currency to deposit ratio. Who controls it? The non-bank public, the people like you and me. तो अब अगर हम assume करें कि ये increase हो जाती है, then the impact on the money supply will be decreased. क्योंकि this again is a leakage from the system. We take a certain portion out of that cycle. Therefore, the overall general impact should be a decrease in the quantity of money. अब ये तो था हमारा एक ओवरव्यू ऑफ द मनी मल्टीप्लायर. उससे पहले हमने डिपॉजिट मल्टीप्लायर की बात की. स्ट्रिंजेंट अजम्पशन के साथ पहले हमने कहा एक्सेस रिजर्व नहीं है, करेंसी विड्रॉल नहीं है, एंड वी केम अप विद अ सिंपल मल्टीप्लायर 1 over RD, डिपॉजिट मल्टीप्लायर. एंड लेटर ऑन वी रिलैक्स्ड दोज अजम्पशंस. We talked about the positive excess reserve. We talked about कि currency holding by the public is also positive. And then we came up with a scenario in which we said there are 4 factors which will decide the quantity of money. And we looked at the relationships as well. Now we are discussing another aspect, and that is the central bank's monetary policy toolbox. We said when we look at the objectives of the central bank, अब सेंट्रल बैंक के पास आपको याद होगा कि पिछले 3-4 लेक्चर्स में हम बात करते रहे हैं कि पॉलिसी मेकर्स जो हैं दे डेफिनेटली असाइन सर्टेन ऑब्जेक्टिव्स टू द सेंट्रल बैंक, और उन ऑब्जेक्टिव्स में सबसे पहले था हमारा लो एंड स्टेबल इन्फ्लेशन, एंड देन वी सेड ओके हाई एंड स्टेबल ग्रोथ along with the higher employment. Thirdly, we said stable financial system. And then finally, we said stable foreign exchange rate and the stable interest rate. ये सारे objective हैं. So, there are not many objectives and of course, difficult to achieve. Now, the question arises कि what are the tools? कि central bank के tool box में क्या-क्या चीजें हैं जिनके through वो इन ऑब्जेक्टिव को अचीव कर सकता है. एज विल प्रोसीड फर्दर हम ये देखेंगे कि ऑब्जेक्टिव्स तो बहुत ज्यादा हैं, लेकिन टूल बॉक्स में हमारे पास जो चीजें हैं वो इतनी ज्यादा नहीं है. देन वी आल्सो टॉक्ड अबाउट अ सिनेरियो जिसमें हमने ये कहा था कि अगर सेंट्रल बैंक को ये सारे ऑब्जेक्टिव अचीव करने हैं तो हमें क्या होना चाहिए कि सेंट्रल बैंक को इंडिपेंडेंस देनी चाहिए, ऑटोनोमस उनको होना चाहिए, सबसे बड़ी बात. एंड सेकेंडली वी सेड कि वंस दे आर ऑटोनोमस दे शुड बी ट्रांसपेरेंट, और ट्रांसपेरेंसी जो है उसकी वजह से एफिशिएंसी जो है वो पैदा होती है. एंड वी आल्सो सेड द डिसीजन मेकिंग शुड बी मेड बाय कमेटी इंस्टेड ऑफ अ सिंगल पर्सन. बहुत से जितने भी एक्सपीरियंस लोग हैं, इफ दे सिट टुगेदर एंड दे come up with a solution, it is hoped कि वो solution जो है वो एक single policy maker के decision से बेहतर होगा. तो ये सारी चीजें जो है, और एक और लास्टली हमने ये कहा था कि एक सेंट्रल बैंक को अच्छी तरह से कम्युनिकेट करना चाहिए विद द रेस्ट ऑफ द आर्गुमेंट ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल सिस्टम, द पार्टिसिपेंट्स ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल सिस्टम. तो हैविंग सेट द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स फॉर द सेंट्रल बैंक, in providing the central bank also fulfills all of these prerequisites of autonomy and then transparency, committee decision making and then good communication. Now let's see कि अब सेंट्रल बैंक जो है इन ऑब्जेक्टिव्स को किस तरह से अचीव कर सकता है. अब उसके पॉलिसी टूल बॉक्स में क्या क्या चीजें जो है वो मौजूद हैं. नॉर्मली हमारे पास जो है हम कह सकते हैं कि there are 3 tools in the toolbox of the central bank. ये वो टूल है जिनकी थ्रू सेंट्रल बैंक अपने इन ऑब्जेक्टिव्स को, जो अभी हम पहले बात करते आए हैं, सेंट्रल बैंक ट्राइज टू अचीव. अब वो टूल बॉक्स में क्या क्या टूल्स हैं? वाइडली यूज्ड, कॉमनली नोन ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशन, जिसको हम कहते हैं OMO. अब क्या है ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशन? के परचेज एंड द सेल ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज. दैट इज वन टूल एंड द टूल बॉक्स ऑफ द सेंट्रल बैंक्स पॉलिसी. सेकेंडली, वी आल्सो looked at the role of the central bank as a lender of the last resort. हमने कहा था कि हमारा सेंट्रल बैंक जो है वो 2 रोल परफॉर्म करता है. एक तो उसका रोल है एज ए गवर्नमेंट्स बैंक, और उसमें वो कहते थे मोनोपोली पावर है, प्रिंटिंग मनी, और वो सारी सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड करता है सेंट्रल बैंक गवर्नमेंट को, जो कि एक कमर्शियल बैंक हमें प्रोवाइड करता है. और साथ साथ हमने ये भी कहा था कि वो बैंकर्स बैंक है, और बैंकर्स बैंक में हमने ये कहा था कि द सेंट्रल बैंक एक्ट्स एज द लेंडर ऑफ द लास्ट रिसोर्ट. तो इसमें क्या है कि व्हेनेवर द बैंक्स आर इन ट्रबल मीन्स कि इनको लिक्विडिटी प्रॉब्लम है. इफ दे आर इनलिक्विड बट दे आर सॉल्वेंट, तो बैंक जो है एक्ट्स एज द लेंडर ऑफ द लास्ट रिसोर्ट. और वो किस तरह करता है कि बैंक प्रोवाइड देम विद द लोन, और वो जो लोन है उसको हम कहते हैं डिस्काउंट लोन। तो ये एक सेकंड टूल है। एंड थर्डली वी टॉक अबाउट अनदर टूल, और वो क्या है कि रिजर्व रिक्वायरमेंट। अब रिजर्व रिक्वायरमेंट क्या है, यही हमारी रिक्वायर्ड रिजर्व रेशियो जो है इसके थ्रू। सो ओवरऑल इफ वी वांट टू समराइज वी से द सेंट्रल बैंक हैज 3 मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी टूल्स और इंस्ट्रूमेंट। द टारगेट फेडरल फंड्स रेट, अब ये टारगेट फेडरल फंड्स रेट जो है इसको सेंट्रल बैंक कंट्रोल करता है थ्रू ओएमओ, ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशन, परचेज एंड सेल ऑफ सिक्योरिटीज। तो फेडरल फंड रेट बेसिकली अभी हम आगे जाके इसको डिटेल में देखेंगे, बट अभी हम सिर्फ लिस्ट डाउन कर रहे हैं कि दीज आर दी 3 पॉलिसी इंस्ट्रूमेंट, द टारगेट फेडरल फंड रेट, द डिस्काउंट रेट एंड द रिजर्व रिक्वायरमेंट। अब इनमें से हम पहले से शुरू करते हैं, द टारगेट फेडरल फंड्स रेट। अब ये टारगेट फेडरल फंड्स रेट एंड द ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशंस, व्हाट आर वी ट्राइंग टू से हियर? हम ये कह रहे हैं कि हमारा जो सेंट्रल बैंक है it tries to control the federal fund rate, but first of all let's define federal fund rate. Federal funds rate is the interbank borrowing and lending rate. कि बैंक को जब लिक्विडिटी प्रॉब्लम होता है तो they do not directly go to the central bank, rather there is one window before that the banks can borrow and lend among themselves. कि एक बैंक जिसके पास अगर सरप्लस है कैश या लिक्विड एसेट्स, वो जो है वो लेंड कर सकता है टू अनदर बैंक जो कि डिफिशिएंट है। तो हमारा जो इंटर बैंक बोरोइंग एंड लैंडिंग रेट है दैट इज द फेडरल फंड रेट। अब नॉर्मली banks whenever they have the liquidity problem they do not directly go to the central bank. There are reasons behind that. क्योंकि अगर वो सेंट्रल बैंक के पास जाते हैं तो what happens? They are giving a signal that they have exhausted the first option, that the other banks were not willing to lend them out. It sends a signal to the market that the credibility of the bank in the eyes of the other bank, or the financial health or the solvency or the soundness of the bank in the eyes of the other bank is not that good. So that's why the bank has gone to borrow from the central bank. So the target federal funds rate is the central bank's primary policy instrument. The federal funds rate is determined in the market rather than being controlled by the central bank. अब फेडरल फंड्स रेट जो है, जैसे बोरोइंग एंड लेंडिंग कौन कर रहा है? कमर्शियल बैंक्स। सो वन बैंक इज सप्लाइंग द क्रेडिट एंड द अदर बैंक इज डिमांडिंग द क्रेडिट। सो सप्लाई एंड डिमांड इन द मार्केट प्लेस डिटर्मिन्स द फेडरल फंड रेट। सो एज अ लेंडर द सेंट्रल बैंक वुड नीड टू मेक अनसिक्योर्ड लोन्स टू कमर्शियल बैंक्स, and as a borrower the central bank would in effect be paying interest on the excess reserve. Lekin why are we saying so? We need to go back and see central bank holds the capacity to force the market federal funds rate to equal the target rate all the time by participating directly in the market for overnight reserves, both as a borrower and as a lender. अब हम बात ये करना चाह रहे हैं कि हमने कहा कि एक हमारे पास टारगेट फेडरल फंड रेट है, दैट इज डिसाइडेड बाय द सेंट्रल बैंक। एक हमारे पास मार्केट का फेडरल फंड रेट है जो कि इंटरबैंक बोरोइंग एंड लैंडिंग का रेट है। अब सेंट्रल बैंक जो है थ्रू पार्टिसिपेटिंग इन द फेडरल फंड मार्केट बाइंग एंड सेलिंग द सिक्योरिटीज के थ्रू ट्राइज टू ब्रिंग दैट मार्केट रेट क्लोजर टू द टारगेट फेडरल फंड रेट। और इसमें क्या है कि when the central bank is participating in the market through the purchase and sale of securities, it is influencing the credit in the market. But the central bank tries to bring the actual federal fund rate closer to the target rate. and that is done through the open market operation. तो जब वो borrower lender की हैसियत से participate करता है सेंट्रल बैंक, जब वो परचेज करता है सिक्योरिटीज तो इज lending, और जब वो सेल करता है सिक्योरिटीज इज borrowing. तो उस सूरत हाल में भी दे हैव टू पे द कॉस्ट ऑफ borrowing and they also earn interest on it. So the central bank chooses to control the federal funds rate by manipulating the quantity of reserve through open market operation. The central bank buys or sells securities to add or drain reserves as required. कि वो डायरेक्टली अगर वो जाएगा और बोरो करेगा और लेंड करेगा तो उसमें कॉस्ट भी आएगी और उसमें अर्निंग्स भी होगी. तो रादर सेंट्रल बैंक जो है वो क्या करता है, डिसाइड्स टू पार्टिसिपेट बट open market operation, and through the open market operation a change in the reserves of the other banks with the central bank. तो इस टॉपिक को इंशाल्लाह we are going to discuss and elaborate further in the next lecture. We just stopped here and we are going to talk about the other policy tools and the allied issues in the next lecture. But before we close our today's lecture, so let's go back and see what we have discussed in today's lecture. So today we started discussing the deposit multiplier in a simple word in which we said excess reserve is 0 and the currency withdrawal is also 0. With that we said our deposit multiplier is equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio, and so was the money multiplier, 1 over RD, because excess reserve were 0 and there were no currency withdrawals. Later on we relaxed the assumptions and we said what if the excess reserves are positive as well as the currency withdrawals are also there. Then we said okay, let's define the excess reserve ratio, ER over the deposit, and also define the currency withdrawal ratio as C over D. Then we came up with a deposit multiplier which was 1 over the deposit required reserve ratio, excess reserve ratio and the currency deposit ratio. Now when we talked about the money multiplier, then the money multiplier was simply C over D plus 1, and in the denominator we have these same three ratios. And we said okay, the monetary base is positively related to the quantity of money, whereas the required reserve ratio, excess reserve ratio and the cash withdrawals, they were negatively related to the quantity of money. Later on we started talking about the policy tools for the central banks. The central bank is always assigned with certain objectives. And we talked about those objectives in our previous lectures, and we said how the central bank can achieve these objectives. What are the instruments? What are the policy tools? And then we said that there are three main policy tools. Number one is the federal funds rate through the open market operation. Number two, the discount rate, which is borrowing by the commercial bank from the central bank or lending by the central bank to the commercial bank. And thirdly, required reserve ratio. But in today's lecture we only focused on the first policy tool, which was the federal fund rate. The federal funds rate is also the interbank borrowing and lending rate. Actual federal funds rate is decided by the market, but the target federal funds rate is decided by the central bank. Now the central bank tries to bring the actual federal fund rate close to the target rate by conducting the open market operation, which means purchase and sale. So we'll inshallah continue with the rest of the topics in next lecture. तो आज के लिए डॉक्टर तालत को इजाजत दीजिए. अल्लाह हाफिज.